This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. Another absolutely huge week. We've had that crazy, historic, controversial march across the Harbour Bridge over the weekend. So what does it really mean? Is it going to make any difference in the conflict between Israel and Palestine or the starvation in Gaza? I'll reveal everything about that. Plus, China is not just on our doorstep, it's in among us. We've just had the arrest of an alleged Chinese operative infiltrating organisations in Canberra. So how do these spies really work? And how do our spies really work? I'll reveal a little bit about that as well. Plus, what is China's endgame? What are they trying to do with us? What are they trying to do to us? I'll speak to someone who is the ultimate expert in these matters. All that and more coming up. So first up, I want to talk about the really big issue that has been consuming pretty much everybody in the media and politics this week, and that is this march across the Harbour Bridge on Sunday. This was an historic event in many ways. Almost 100,000 people, about 90,000 people, they reckon, marched across the Harbour Bridge. There were, of course, other protest marches in Melbourne especially, as well. But it was the Harbour Bridge march that really caught the nation's attention because I think so few people expected it to happen, and because the Harbour Bridge is such an iconic image of not just Sydney but Australia. And so when people saw this symbol co-opted for a particular cause, it caused very visceral emotions among some sections of the community, and there were other people who were also a bit uneasy about it as well. People who were very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but weren't quite comfortable with how the bridge got pulled into it. This was, of course, a march for Gaza, a march for Palestine, a march for humanity, a march against Israel, and a march, according to some placards that were being held, a march for the Ayatollah of Iran. And that, I think, is part of the problem and the complexity with what took place on the weekend, that there were all these sort of different causes and agendas, some of which were purely humanitarian and compassionate, like the awful situation in Gaza, where you have, obviously, no matter where you stand, I think you have to acknowledge that there is a huge amount of starvation, just catastrophic results fueled by both, I dare say, Hamas and Israel. But there was also a whole bunch of people, again, who were, holding flags that were linked to terror organisations, holding pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the most barbarous, brutal, murderous, theocratic dictator of Iran. So how did it happen, and what was it for, and what difference will it even make? What were they trying to achieve? And this is what kind of gets me about these things, about these protests. Yes, obviously, anyone with any sense of compassion, with a human heart, is horrified by what's happening in Gaza. But what does jumping up and down and saying how horrified you are, and kind of, I dare say, making it a bit about you instead of about the people who are starving, what does that actually achieve? And what are you trying to achieve by that? So this was a march that, like, I suppose, the march before it and the march before that and all the other marches that have been happening every weekend since the October 7 terror attack by Hamas and Israel's reprisals have been taking place in capital cities across Australia, but most particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And after this image of a poor young child starving, being held by his mother, circulated around the world, this seemed to escalate things and certainly created a huge amount of sympathy for the Gazan situation, which was not necessarily there before. Sympathy that came from, ultra-conservative newspapers, for example, that would have been otherwise very pro-Israel, but said, hang on, no, enough is enough. But anyway, this created this sort of global momentum. And of course, what does the usual rent-a-crowd in Australia that's been protesting every week to no avail, what do they think this is the time to do? have another protest. So you've actually got this kind of sea change in sort of global sentiment, and most importantly, the sentiment of the US president, Donald Trump. I'm not sure the protesters are too fond of him, but he's the one who the image has affected, who is in the most powerful position to affect what Israel actually does. And it seems that he did have a word, because Israel eased the supply of aid into Gaza once that picture did the rounds, and Donald Trump said how concerned he was by it. But these guys say, no, we'll just go and have another protest, and we'll piss off half of Sydney by shutting down the Harbour Bridge and the CBD, and this will, again, do what? So neither the protesters nor the government actually thought that this would be able to go ahead. The state government in New South Wales said absolutely no way. The cops said no way. This is a public safety issue, apart from the massive inconvenience to shutting down the biggest piece of infrastructure in Sydney, or the CBD, where police say just don't go because it's going to be a nightmare. It's also a crowd safety issue, the safety of the marchers themselves, when you have that many people all in the one place, all on a piece of vital infrastructure, and with no time to actually prepare, and for the police to make contingency plans and transport arrangements and make sure there's ways for people to get off and out. And indeed, that was what ended up happening, but not before the Supreme Court said, oh, no, it'll be fine. Very weird decision by the court. But yes, no, they took it to the court. Even the protesters seemed to think that they weren't going to get approval, because they were making noise. They were just going to do it anyway. But the judge said, yeah, no, fine. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, go for it. No worries. Inspiring. And then exactly what happened was what police had feared, that there was the threat of a massive crush. They were deeply alarmed, and they basically had to tell the protesters to stop and turn around when they were halfway across the bridge, because they could see it all bottling up into a situation where there could be a massive crowd crush. And eyewitnesses were saying the same thing, that it looked really, really hairy. So nonetheless, they got their pick-up, they got their photo holding the banner, they got their photo of people holding a picture of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And what did it actually achieve? What impact did it actually have? Well, did it have any impact on Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the one person in the most immediate position to be able to, if, again, all these claims that it's simply Israel that's lifting the boom gate on the aid coming in or out, did it have any impact on him letting the aid come in or out? Well, no, because Israel had already let more aid in on the back of that picture that did the rounds. However questionable you might think the picture is, it created enough of a change in global mood for Israel to think, oh, we better do something about this and stop looking like the pariahs, stop looking like the bad guys. And again, what was the biggest factor in that? It was Donald Trump. It was Donald Trump, just like when Melania, saw the pictures of Ukraine being bombed by the Russians and had a quiet word and goes, oh, really? Yeah, maybe the Russians are the bad guys. Better do something about that. If only I knew the president of the United States. Oh, hang on, that's me. Woohoo! So Donald, he comes around on Ukraine, and made the same noises about what was happening in Gaza after the photo did the rounds. Donald is a very visual guy. He bombed Syria after he saw the pictures of the children who'd been affected by the chemical weapons. He sees that, he says, oh, that's not right. Maybe he's a simple man, but, he sees something, he doesn't like it, he does something about it. He's been the only person on the face of the planet, bar none, who's been able to get Benjamin Netanyahu to change his mind, to do something he doesn't want to do. He was the one who got Netanyahu to turn the planes around when they were on their way back to Iran for another bombing raid just after the US had dismantled, destroyed the nuclear bunkers. And Bibi wanted to, re-escalate again after a bit of tit for tat. And Trump famously said, they don't know what the they're doing. And he got on the phone and those planes got turned around. No one else has been able to do that, right? No one else has that kind of power on the planet. So again, if the protesters really want to, make an impact, they should be protesting in favour of Donald Trump. Say, go Donald, you tell him. He's the only one who's been able to make a difference. That is just a fact, whether you like the guy or not. But of course, they don't like Donald Trump either. So that, I suppose, is the first kind of question. Like, what difference do you think this march is going to make over there? The second is, okay, well, maybe we just have to take care of what's happening in our own backyard and say, Anthony Albanese, we want you to do this. We want Australia to say this, that, or the other, or do this, that, or the other. Obviously, Israel's not listening to Australia either. Albo, I don't think, was even able to get a phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu this week. And, why would he? I mean, I don't think the two are particularly close friends, and Australia's been very critical of Israel, often rightly so. Then you say, all right, well, why doesn't Australia just come out and do what the UK or France has done and just say, oh, now we recognise Palestine as a state. We're just going to recognise it. Okay, well, what state? Who? Hamas? Hamas is still the government of Gaza, but everyone says that the condition of the Palestine statehood is Hamas can have no role because they are literally a prescribed terrorist organisation. So do you say, oh, no, actually it's okay if Hamas stays? That's fine, they can stay there? You say, no, Hamas has to go. So, all right, well, what if the people of Gaza vote for Hamas? Well, what if the same people under the same name or even a different name run for election and get voted in? You're going to say, no, you voted the wrong way. You're not allowed to do that. You can have democracy, but only if you vote the way we tell you to. Because that's how Hamas got in last time. They were elected. They got voted in. That is why they are still officially the government of Gaza. So is that the state that the protesters want Australia to just sort of unilaterally recognise? Not that even if they did that, even if we did that, it would make the slightest difference whatsoever. Australia or France or the UK doesn't just get to decide to wish a country into existence and it just happens. And that, of course, is just Gaza. That's just one part of the future Palestinian state. What about the West Bank? West Bank is run by a completely different government, completely different organisation, by Fatah, which hates Hamas and is terrified of Hamas because if they had an election in the West Bank, Hamas would probably win there too, or at least would have before the whole, hoo-ha with the civil war and the terrorist atrocities and everything. And, of course, even in the West Bank, you've got Hebron, the Sheikh of Hebron, is saying, no, we want to declare ourselves our own independent kind of Palestine, align ourselves with other Arab states, recognise Israel. Hebron's the largest city in the West Bank. So now you've got 3 Palestinian states run by 3 different parties, organisations, systems of government. Do you just recognise all of them? Like, what actually happens? And this is the thing. It's fine to jump up and down and say how upset you are, how outraged you are about whatever's happening over there. And I get it. I'm upset. I'm outraged. You couldn't be human and not be upset and outraged by what's happening. But what do you want to happen? How do you want to fix it? What's your plan that you've got in your head that you're so sure about that makes you smarter than the smartest brains on the planet who haven't been able to fix this for the last 80 years? But no, you just go and have a protest, go and have a march, do a few chants, and that'll solve everything. That is what I don't get. Now, the other big story this week is, of course, the arrest of this alleged Chinese spy operating in Canberra, infiltrating a Buddhist club. Now, I've got to say, I know a lot of people have made a lot of sacrifices for their country, but this to me seems the ultimate one. I cannot think of anything more boring, more soul-crushingly earnest and dull than having to infiltrate a Buddhist club when you're not even a Buddhist. I mean, that is a level of commitment. You almost kind of think, I wish she'd got away with it, because once you're there, I mean, I don't know, how long do you have to meditate for before you achieve self-actualization and nirvana? What if you're there doing it, just sitting there doing the full lotus? And you don't even think you're going to get there. You don't even believe in it. Everyone else has got their mantra. They're You just have to sit there through that, knowing that you're never going to get there, knowing that the only true nirvana is the People's Republic of China. I mean, that is commitment. Anyway, Alleged. But great work by our spooks, both here and abroad, but ASIO, obviously the domestic spy agency, which uncovered this, and then, of course, the AFP, which publicly arrested this person, a Chinese national who was a permanent resident of Australia. And the most interesting thing about this was done under new laws that were just recently passed. And the most interesting thing is that this was public, and it was done under new laws, which were obviously publicly passed, and it was done after Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, the Director General of ASIO, very publicly said, we know that China is in here. It's got its fingers in our pie. We know you're crawling all over the joint, and we'd like you to stop it, please, because it's costing us a lot of money. Costing us more than $10 billion, I think, in the last year, 13 billion, something like that, in the last year. Foreign interference is costing us. And that is the interesting thing about all this. Not that it's happening, because it's always happening. You should just assume that spies are just crawling among us all the time, but that it's public. Usually these things get taken care of behind closed doors. Someone might just be quietly booted out of the country, or a spying network or a capability might just be quietly disabled. And again, you also have diplomats in Australia who are effectively spying all the time, but they have diplomatic immunity, and we know they're doing it, but there's nothing much we can do about it, because, of course, if we crack down too hard on them, then guess what? Our diplomats, who are doing the exact same thing in other countries, they get cracked down on as well. So there's a sort of thing, it's almost like a gentleman's agreement that all of this stuff is going on, and everyone's gathering information and reporting back to their respective governments. And again, this is not James Bond stuff. This is not jumping out of helicopters or, unearthing secret lairs at the bottom of volcanoes. This is people who often have perfectly normal or, respectable day jobs. Again, they'll often be diplomats or people who work in various overseas roles, who will just be doing a little bit of spying on the side. What did you learn today, buddy? Well, I learnt that, China is ramping up its surveillance of the Taiwan Straits. Oh, great. So this sort of thing sort of happens all the time. And so the fact that this has been made public is actually the most interesting thing about it, in my view, is that the government is actually saying, and again, you get all these people saying, oh, Anthony Albanese isn't standing up to China. Well, actually, this is what standing up to China looks like, saying, you know what? You've crossed a line. You've infiltrated the Buddhist club. You can take whatever you want. Take the Bureau of Meteorology. We know that you did that, but you touch our Buddhists and you're going home, mister. So this is what it actually looks like. And I think it shows that Australia is actually standing up to China. We are showing them that we know what they're up to. And maybe that's our pathway to our own nirvana. Well, it wouldn't be an episode of The Real Story if we didn't have World War III on our doorstep. And this week, well, kind of maybe it sort of is. We've just had, of course, the alleged Chinese spy be arrested in Canberra. We've got a new deal with Japan to buy a whole fleet of frigates, which we've been sorely needing for well over a decade now, because basically had one bloke in a rowboat circumnavigating the country. And so we need an Uber expert to tell us what is actually happening in the region. Are we going to go to war with China over Taiwan? What is China trying to do with us or for us? And we've got one. Jennifer Parker is the principal and founder of Barrier Strategic Advisory. She's an expert associate at the National Security College of the Australian National University and an adjunct fellow in naval studies at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, and has 20 years experience working at very senior levels in the Department of Defence. Jen, welcome to The Real Story. What did you make of the revelations about the arrest of the alleged Chinese operative in Canberra this week? I suppose it just shows how omnipresent China's reach is in this region, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does, Joe. And I think it comes on the back, too, of quite an impactful speech from the ASIO Director General, Mike Burgess, last week, where he actually said that over the past 3 years, there had been 24 major interference incidents. Now, what that involves, it's not exactly clear. But he's talking about this idea of foreign interference costing the economy, $12.5 billion in the last 12
Yeah.
months. So it is, I guess, a public manifestation of what the ASIO director has been talking about, saying that state actors, and particularly China, not just China, there's been examples of Russia and Iran as well, and other countries, are very interested in what Australia is doing. Now, that's not just the Australian government and the Australian military, but that's also, as we see from this reporting this week, the Chinese diaspora. And this
Yeah.
example is actually foreign interference where we've seen alleged
Alleged.
Australian permanent resident actually infiltrating and reporting on a group within the Chinese diaspora that is banned in China. So we are seeing this permeate through Australia.
And this is obviously, and again, not talking about this case generally, specifically, which is before the courts, but generally, it is a common tactic, is it not, of the Chinese Communist Party to apply pressure on Chinese residents in Australia that either A, puts pressure on them in their lives here, but also potentially on family members and relations back home as well. So it sort of applies. It's a very totalitarian approach, I suppose, isn't it?
It is, and it's not just in Australia. It is happening through kind of China's United Fronts work concept around the world, but Australia has had a number of experiences of this now. And look, this is only the third charges laid under our kind of semi-recent 2018 foreign interference laws, but there are other examples. There's been a lot of investigations into pressure applied through Chinese media in Australia and Chinese social media in Australia, and that pressure on the Chinese diaspora to either influence thinking around elections or other debates within Australia. In fact, there was I can't remember which channel, maybe I can't mention on here anyway. There was
That's
an
right.
interesting documentary in terms of how this was applied through things like the Yes campaign in Australia and the debate around that, and how there was actually a pressure on the Chinese diaspora around this, which seems a little bit strange, but it is part of this broader foreign interference issue that we're experiencing in Australia. And from the Director General ASIO's speech last week, it's only going to get worse. And that kind of reflects the greater global uncertainty.
Yeah, that's right. And indeed in election campaigns as well, whether or not there's been tacit or subtle pressure put on the Chinese community here to vote one way or the other, because that's what the CCP perceives to be in China's national interest as well. What do you make of the fact that it was this was done so publicly, obviously under the new laws as well, but these things are often taken care of covertly. ASIO will be aware of things and will monitor them or disable what is going on without it being made public. The fact that this has been made public, do you think this is a deliberate attempt by our security agencies to send a message to Beijing to say, look, we know what you're doing, please stop it?
Look, I think it probably is, and I think that you've got to read that in the messaging that we're seeing from Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, where he's becoming increasingly public about some of the incidents. I mean, in his speech last week, he described a range of incidents where foreign actors. Now you can read which foreign actors they are. I think it's
right.
pretty obvious.
Yeah, I think we know.
Buying up infrastructure around bases or encouraging some of their agents to apply for government jobs. And he gives a list of examples. So I think the AFP's releasing of these charges having been laid, and their statement is pretty clear.
Yeah, that's right.
Is part of this, I think, broader campaign. And that's why I refer so much to Mike Burgess's speech last week, because it is, I think it's trying to make the general public aware of this pressure.
That's right. The first law of spycraft is you don't tell people what you're doing, but he's actually come out and said, look, we see you, we know what you're doing, and, just don't think you can get away. Speaking more broadly, you wrote a great piece recently about China and its long-term ambitions for Taiwan and in the region more generally. But what is China's endgame in your view? Is it just we know they openly say Taiwan isn't a real country, it's part of us, we want it back. Is that their end game there? Do they say once that's their one united China, do they just stop, or are they going to continue to want to assert assert their authority in the region, control all the sea lanes, like in the South China Sea, where they're sort of building these man-made islands? Are they going to want to assert more sort of economic and strategic dominance over other people in the region? What is China's end game? What do they want, Jen?
Well, look, if I knew that, I'd probably be a billionaire. But I guess some of the key elements of this is China certainly sees reunification of Taiwan. Now, there are debates about whether it was ever part of China. In fact, Taiwan, as it is now, was never part of the People's Republic of China, which came about in 1949 after the
Correct.
Civil
Yep.
War. But clearly, they see the island of Formosa as part of their core interests, and they have stated that. They also see control over the South China Sea as part of their core interests. And China is kind of working towards this national rejuvenation. And they've got a number of goals under this national rejuvenation, which needs to occur by 2049, 2049 being the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Those goals are economic in nature, they are military in nature, they are political in nature. When it comes to Taiwan, look, I think China's been incredibly clear. And if anyone is unclear on their message, you need to just watch the footage
That's right.
of the joint military drills that they are doing around Taiwan now on a fairly regular basis. You know, they're releasing cartoons of missiles striking Taiwan. They're releasing cartoons of the president of Taiwan as a parasite leaking over Taiwan. This is quite aggressive, and I think I think China hasn't decided yet what they intend to do with Taiwan. I think the Chinese Communist Party would very much like Taiwan to just agree.
Yep.
But that is not going to happen. And certainly the recent election beginning of last year of President Lai Ching-chai, many of his statements around the relationship between China and Taiwan have become, I guess, more clear about how he sees that relationship. And that's certainly not what the CCP is like. So where does this all end? Look, I don't think we know, but we can't take off the cards the chances of some sort of military conflict, right? So it's not
Yep.
inevitable, but it is increasingly likely. We are seeing China conduct stockpiling of certain goods and commodities. We are seeing this the increased size, the increased complexity of these drills around Taiwan, the increased strength in their propaganda. And so the idea of China attempting to either blockade or invade Taiwan in the near future, I think, although not inevitable, is certainly not off the cards. And it's something that the region of Australia needs to be prepared for. But I think it extends beyond Taiwan. It is about China having a degree of control, which they intend to assert militarily over the region, both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia.
Which, of course, China historically has. It's really only been in the last sort of century or two that China hasn't been the absolute master of all it surveys. So I suppose I don't suppose, they openly say that this is actually just reasserting China's sort of historic right. What does that mean for Australia? So if China does attempt to retake Taiwan or take Taiwan and invade it, if the US then gets drawn into that conflict and is defending Taiwan, and it has, a sort of deliberately ambiguous, and is actually called an ambiguous stance on Taiwan, but it seems that the US would be prepared to defend it in such a case. Does Australia then get drawn into that? I mean, the ANZUS Treaty obviously obliges us to consult with the US anytime there's a threat to us. Would that constitute a threat to the US, and therefore ANZUS would be triggered and we'd have to join in? Or would that require a separate commitment from Australia? And then if we didn't give that commitment, would that mean that AUKUS is off the cards? I mean, there's a real sort of house of cards here, isn't there?
There is, and this is really kind of one of the key questions at the centre of Australia's strategic debate right now. I guess before I get to that, I'd just say that, China, of course, is an incredibly powerful economy. It has a huge population, although it has some challenges with that.
Yep.
It has a huge population. It is a key player in this region, and we do need to have a constructive relationship. But when it comes to their aggression in the cyber domain, the space domain, the maritime domain, it is not in Australia's interest to exist in a region where we're subject to that degree of coercion. And, we've talked about the economic coercion at length in our media, but, we don't talk so much about the experiences that our ADF women and men have in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, where our assets, our planes, our aircraft operating in international airspace and international seas are harassed by Chinese vessels. So
Yep.
there is this military aggression. Over Taiwan, look, I think we need to think about this debate a little bit differently. I don't see if China makes a decision to invade Taiwan, they need to go 100 nautical miles across the strait. That's a long way with a big invasion force. Taiwan itself, geographically as an island, is very difficult to invade because of the nature of beaches, because of the mountains. I mean, even getting to Taipei, you'd have to fight through jungle, you'd have to fight through mountains. So it's a really difficult prospect. And in fact, during World War II, because of course there is a long history of Japan having colonized
Yes.
Taiwan, during World War II, the US actually planned initially as part of their campaign moving north, taking islands to the north, which ended in them taking Okinawa. They planned to take Taiwan. They actually didn't because it was such a difficult military task. So they abandoned it. So I think if you think about an invasion of Taiwan in that context, if China makes the decision to do it, my view is that this would be a regional conflict instantly. Because any military planner looking at that is unlikely to leave US and Japanese assets to the north of them as they attempt this difficult feat, or US assets to the south of them in the Philippines. So I think that if China made the decision, you may well see preemptive strikes on US assets in the region, in Japan and the Philippines. And in that context, if that happens, then actually what you're looking at is a regional conflict where Australia's key ally and two of its key partners have been engaged. You're looking at a contested maritime domain where Australia as a trading nation will be severely impacted. I mean, we import 91% of our fuel at the moment in a refined state that comes from Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. It is difficult to see a scenario where in that context Australia isn't directly threatened in terms of not our geography necessarily, but our vital interests.
Yep.
So we're involved in that scenario. Now, in terms of the ANZUS Treaty, there's different arguments about the interpretation of the 11 articles in the ANZUS Treaty. Yes, there is a duty to consult. There is also some degree of a duty to respond. Now, it's not like Article 5 in NATO, but there is some sort of obligation. And I think there would be an expectation of Australia, but not just the expectation. I mean, we need to think back to what are our national interests? And our national interests would be significantly impacted. So I think we would be involved. Should we be pre-committing to have deals on submarines? No. As you mentioned before, the US position is one of strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
No government of Australia should either privately or publicly commit to a hypothetical scenario, and that's what we're talking about. But we should understand that in the event of a regional conflict, it would be difficult for Australia not to be involved. And as I said before, Australia would likely be cut off.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of, obviously, the AUKUS deal is under review, quote unquote, by the Trump administration. How much is this kind of performative, and how much do you think the treaty is actually the pact is actually under threat or under real sort of consideration? Because, of course, Trump came out with Keir Starmer and at least didn't interrupt him when Keir Starmer said that the UK part of AUKUS was absolutely 100% going ahead. Do you think that this review by the Pentagon is actually Trump about to tear up AUKUS, or is it just him posturing to put himself in a better position so that when he does meet Albanese, he can say, look, you increased defence spending to 3%, or, the chicken gets it?
Well, maybe the chicken gets it. But look, actually, I think, when it comes to AUKUS, we need to remember that there is a lot in this deal for the US.
Yeah.
So I can't predict the future. Again, if I could predict the future, I'd be a billionaire. But I think if we think about the core interests of the US, so the ability to operate from Australia, the ability to expand their maintenance base for submarines, because we'll be able to maintain submarines in Australia, and then the wider support Australia provides, including things like, on Northwest Cape, where we support the US's ability to communicate with their nuclear submarines through our communication station. I think the wider relationship as well plays into this. So I think it's highly unlikely the US is going to decide that AUKUS is not in their interest and rip it up. They didn't enter AUKUS for altruistic reasons. No country does things like this for altruistic. All three countries entered AUKUS for their own national interests, and those national interests aren't the same. So I think it is of great benefit to the US. If you think about it in that context, then I think that they will do everything they can to make it work. And that, to be fair, the person leading the review, Eldridge Colby, actually said that when he went through his Senate confirmation hearings in January this year. I also don't think this review was directed by Trump. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that AUKUS is not a focus of Trump. He's more focused on Europe. He's more focused on the Middle East. This was directed internally in the Pentagon. Now, there are pressures and risks to AUKUS. The US submarine industrial base is one. But I would argue 3 submarines in the 30s. So under AUKUS Phase 2, Australia is meant to be sold 3 Virginia-class submarines to get us starting to operate the capability before we build our own. 3 submarines in the 30s for the US on paper versus everything they get out of the AUKUS deal. I mean, to be honest, you can see they're getting a lot out of it. So I'm not sure they're going to rip it up. Will they change it? Sorry, I don't think they're going to rip it up at all. Will they change it? Maybe. Will that be real changes or just changes around the rhetoric so it looks like a win? Potentially. I mean, we've seen that play out in the tariffs. In terms of using AUKUS as leverage, look, probably. So if we look at the way Donald Trump approached NATO in the NATO conference in June this year, I mean, at the beginning of the year when Trump took over, there was a lot of concern that the US might pull out of NATO, right? This was a real concern. He refused to endorse Article 5. In fact, in June when he got on the plane to the NATO conference, he's like, oh, there's different interpretations of that article. I mean, it's written in plain English. There's no different interpretations. But what he was doing is using it as leverage, US commitment to NATO, US commitment to Article 5, which is an attack on all. Attack on one is an attack on all. He's using it as leverage to get the NATO countries to do what he wants them to do, which is to increase spending. And to be fair, it's not only Trump that's been saying that. I mean, different US administrations have been saying that since like 2000. I found a quote from Condoleezza Rice in 2000 before she took over as the national security advisor saying, hey, Europe need to spend more on defense and do more on conventional defense. The moment Europe agreed to the 3.5% on defence plus 1.5% on national infrastructure, the big 5% of defence spending, Trump sat there with Mark Rutte and said, "Yeah, of course I support
NATO.
Article 5.
NATO's great. It's a great pact. It's a great pact. We're going to have a great time. I would say probably the best ever." And finally, Jen. Speaking of defence spending, we've just done a deal with the Japanese to buy a bunch of naval destroyers. This is a long time coming, isn't it? I mean, we've heard these nightmare stories about Australia's defence capability where there have been reports that there was only one boat in the water at any given point in time. How important is this for both Australia's national security and, again, I suppose, sending a message to the Americans that, yes, we are serious about defence spending. We're not just going to ride on their coattails, and we are going to bulk up our own capability as well.
Look, it's a really important decision. So the Australian government has selected the Japanese upgraded Megami frigate. We're going to acquire 11 of those. 3 will be built in Japan and the other 8 supposedly built in Australia. Not coming until 2030, so there's a time frame issue, but it's very important because you've got to remember, somebody on the ABC made fun of me for saying this, but it's true. Australia is an island nation, right? We forget this when we think about our strategic geography. So this idea that we could just have missiles and UAVs on our borders and protect ourselves is kind of null and void because you don't need to step foot on Australia to impact Australia's national security interests. All you need to do is interdict the 91% of fuel we import or the fertiliser we import you just need to interdict us in the maritime domain. So having a strong Navy really mitigates against that. When you look back at the state of our Navy, the 2009 white paper nearly 20 years ago now said, hey, we need to replace our Anzac class frigates and we need to do a bunch of other things like get 12 submarines. We are in 2025 and we still hadn't had a concrete plan really to replace our Anzac class frigates. There was some stuff around the Hunter. We won't delve into that. So we have actually gotten to the point where the ANAO said in 2019, our current frigates are so old, their hulls are so degraded, they're not going to last much longer. So we really need to make this decision. Our Navy is in a bad state in terms of, despite the hardworking women and men, they have 10 frigates and destroyers. 10 frigates and destroyers for a country that, imports 91% of its fuel is bananas. Yep. So this was an important decision. Will the US like it? Yes, because it is a demonstration that we are trying to strengthen our defence capability. But still, we are not increasing defence spending to the rate they would like at this stage, and we do need to do so. Not just because the US says, but because we actually don't have the range of capabilities we need to protect our own national interests. So this needs to be an important national conversation. Frigates is a good step, but we need to go further.
And I dare say an announcement to that effect will probably come after Anthony Albanese and Donald Trump finally get the world's most sought-after bilateral meeting. Jen Parker, thank you so much for joining us on The Real Story. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much, Joe.
And that is all we have time for this week. Once again, we've given you peace in the Middle East and we've prevented World War III with China. You're welcome, Australia. Please join us again next week. But in the meantime, you can leave us a review or you can leave us a 5-star rating. I don't know if there are any other ratings available. hypothetical point. Let's not get bogged down in academic minutiae. You can also drop us a line at therealstory@novapodcast.com.au, or you can hit me up on the gram, Joe_Hildebrand. Slide into my DMs. You got any questions or anything you want us to look into? And thank you for all the comments and questions and messages I've gotten thus far. Just drop us a line and we'll get into it. Any questions you want answered? Trust me, I know everything, so more than happy to share. You can also grab me in the News Corp newspapers every Monday and Saturday. And if that doesn't float your boat, if that doesn't fill you up, well, there'll be plenty more of The Real Story next week. See you then.